On today's show, we are answering the viewers' questions, highlighted by a top 16 ranking of all the defensemen from the last two draft classes. Who is the very best one? All that coming up on today's show.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this show, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. I'm your host, Sebastian High, the USHL scout over at Elite Prospects. And on today's episode, we'll be answering your questions. And there are a load of these, so we're actually splitting this up into 2 episodes. This is the first part. We're answering 7 questions, including some rather lengthy ones. And we'll have another 7 questions, or perhaps more if I get more questions between now and I record the next episode here for next episode for the following mailbag. So in the first segment, we're going to be focusing on a single question from Soft Serve Scouting, which is to rank my top defensemen between 2024 and 2025 draft classes. And I went out and ranked 16 of them in order. So we'll be delving into that, looking at who the top prospects are on the blue line from these 2 draft classes. Then in the second segment, we'll be delving into just the Ottawa Senators and who they should be drafting at 21st overall, with 3 separate questions there for the Sens. And finally, we'll wrap up the show answering questions on Jake O'Brien's full NHL upside, as well as Axel Sandin Pellikka's fantasy potential for next season already. And last but not least, we'll be delving into the game of a under the radar prospect in the 2025 NHL draft, Kieren Dervin. All that is coming up, so let's just make ourselves comfortable and dive straight into the episode here, because we have a lot to talk about. Kicking things off with that first question from Soft Serve Scouting. Mailbag question. If you had to combine the top D-men between 2025 and 2024, e.g. Schaefer, Smith, Murtka, Hensler, Levshinov, Yakemchuk, Salayev, Parekh, Buium, etc., how would you rank them? This is a fun little exercise, and I didn't put too much thought into the very specific points in this ranking. It's more, I think, based on the ranges where these players are. I put this together in about 10 minutes time, but I think the number 1 player here is quite clear, and it's the number 1 player in the 2025 NHL draft. Matthew Schaefer, to me, is just the top defenseman that we've had going through the draft in the past 2 seasons, despite having missed so much of his draft year campaign. He played less than 20 games here this season, and yet showed in that span, as well as in his D-1 contributions at the OHL and international level, just how much of a game-breaking and difference-making talent he is on the ice. I think that Matthew Schaefer is a truly number 1 potential D-man at the NHL level, and I have more confidence in him reaching that kind of level than any other blue liner that's been eligible in these past 2 seasons. And that, combined with him being very, very young for this draft class and having more runway and more room to grow than almost anyone else in this group, that is just another thing to seal him here at number 1. At number 2, I have Zayne Parekh of the Calgary Flames, a player I did not have ranked as my top defenseman last season. He was 1 slot below Artem Levshinov, so he fell at 6th overall on my board. But at this point, those 2 have swapped places, and Levshinov also swapped places one more time, going down lower, because Zeev Buium has just been fantastic every time I've tuned in to watch him in the past couple months and the last year. And I mean, he was playing here as well for Team USA at the Men's World Championships, and on the way to a gold medal victory, their first in 93 years, which is a pretty obscene stat. But both Parekh and Buium, to me, are very much competing for that number 2 spot. I ended up giving it to Parekh because I see a bit more offensive pop, a bit more dynamism, a bit more creativity on puck than I do with Zeev Buium, but he also has a lower floor than Buium does. So between those 2, take your pick. I don't think you can really go wrong between either, but those are 2 defensemen I see as true potential top pairing guys long-term with Zeev Buium, especially pairing with a guy like Brock Faber down the line. And with Zayne Parekh, there might be an opening as well there in Calgary if Rasmus Andersson does not stick around longer term. And I think that both of these players have real pathways to playing those big minutes and having those huge contributions that I know that they can based on their toolkits. At number 4, I do still have Artem Levshunov, and I do know that Soft Serve Scouting is going to disagree a little bit with this placement because he's not the absolute highest on Levshunov of anyone I've talked to in the scouting community. There's a lot of frustration with how he plays the game. Also doesn't help that he's a Chicago Blackhawks fan and really wanted Ivan Demidov there at the draft, which is rather understandable. That said, I do still see with Levshunov a true pathway to being a number 2 or number 3 defenseman in the NHL. Do I think he was rushed a little bit to the AHL level and should have been given at least another season in college hockey to just like really refine his game further? Absolutely, I do. Do I also disagree with some of the takes coming out of the media that Levshunov was one of the best defensemen for the Blackhawks down the stretch? Yes, I do. I think a lot of that came down to just how mobile and physical he is rather than what he was actually doing on the ice in terms of tilting the ice in his team's favor. He was getting caved on quite a few shifts. But just because he was rushed to this level does not mean that I don't think that at the upside, the potential is still really impressive. This is a player with who's just taking big steps in his development every single year for the last like 4 or 5 seasons. And I don't see that trend just stopping right here. He's going to keep adapting. It might take a little bit more time in the AHL. It might not be a full-time NHLer right out of the gate next season, but he's a really solid prospect that I still have a lot of hopes for. At number 5, I have Sam Dickinson of the San Jose Sharks, a player who's really shown this season the offensive potential he has in this game. He's not just a physical guy that can shut play down off the rush with high-end skating and high-end physicality. I mean, he already looks like a beefy NHL player, let alone just a pro on its own, which is very impressive as a 19-year-old, but he's really taken steps this season, I think, in terms of that on-puck impact and really trying to control shifts there with the London Knights. Still defensive breakdowns. The decision-making is far from perfect. There's still reasons to be a bit hesitant in terms of the overall, like, first pairing potential, but I think he's far too toolsy to not make it in at least a second pair capacity there with the San Jose Sharks. And I think that his chances of reaching a number 2 defenseman role as well are quite possible there. So he's still a player I like a lot. At number 6, I have Jackson Smith of the Tri-City Americans, eligible for the 2025 NHL draft. Incredibly toolsy, wonderful skater, flashed a lot of offensive upside here later down the stretch. He's a player that could easily jump up 2 slots or so in these rankings in like a year's time when he's playing perhaps in a stronger environment. He didn't have all that much support in the WHL this season, but he's a player that's impressed me on every single viewing when I've tuned in. At number 7, sticking again with this year's draft class, I have Radim Murtka, the big 6'6", smooth skating right shot defenseman. He's a player I've liked quite a bit this season. He's very intelligent defensively, shown some flashes of offensive creation. He's not going to be a true offensive defenseman at the next level. He's far more certainly going to be a defensive specialist, but he's a highly intelligent rush defender. He uses his size, his weight, his reach really efficiently to just angle players towards the boards, to kill plays, to smother rushes. And I think that there's also a level of offense that can still be explored in his game. And he's playing absolutely behemoth of big minutes there in the WHL. So with that kind of deployment, he will continue getting those opportunities to shine on the offensive side of the ice. At number 8, we're going back to the 2024 NHL draft, and I've got Cole Hudson, a big riser here from since the draft. He was a player I had ranked higher than most in his draft year season. I believe he ended up at like 24th on my board, 25th on my board there in my final rankings. He was my 9th ranked defenseman in that class, so definitely here a riser considering that he's now at 8th in the combined 2 classes. But Cole Hudson, in terms of the offensive creativity, being able to control shifts in the offensive zone, and just being a consistent player that can compose possession in the offensive zone. Whenever his teammates are under pressure, they can give the puck to him and he will settle things down and put the puck in a better place than where he got it. very intelligent puck mover who's really started to shine in terms of that playmaking, the dynamic skill, layering different things together, combining a lot more like deceptive qualities as well into his puck touches. He's a player that has significant offensive upside. Not quite the Lane Hudson level, I don't think, still, but definitely a player that is going to be able to push up in terms of offensive ability with the Washington Capitals within a couple years' time. At number 9, we have Stian Solberg, the hard-hitting, smooth-skating Norwegian defender, is still a player I've loved to watch. Really, really good internationally this season as well, and I watched a couple games of him there in Sweden against the pro competition, and he just looks so solid. I also checked him out in the AHL when he moved over to the San Diego Gulls towards the end of the season, and he's a guy I've just always appreciated in terms of the runway, the flashes of offensive activation, but more than anything, that combination of rampant physicality and fluid mobility to just crush, rush after rush after rush. Like, he's really a fun player on the defensive side of the puck, and still a player I see a lot of like second pairing potential with, even though the Anaheim Ducks have an absolute logjam of guys in these kind of roles. And then a quick fire here for the last like 6 or 7 players in my top 16. At number 10, Logan Hensler of the University of Wisconsin, another 2025 draft eligible, high-end skating, flashes of offensive activations down the stretch, and a real level of composure while defending the rush, especially in the later part of the season. He's been a riser on my board this campaign and has been a lot closer to the player that we saw all the takes for in his D-1 and D-2 seasons than the player who started the season here with Wisconsin, and it was not an ideal environment either for a player of his style to flourish. At number 11, I have Carter Yakemchuk of the Ottawa Senators. Very, very gifted offensive defenseman with that physicality, that aggression, high-end shot, great handling ability. The skating still scares me a little bit. The defensive decision-making, the overall scanning and awareness are all still weaknesses in his game. And I think that's a big part of the reason that the offense didn't take a big step this season, even though he was really contending to crack the Ottawa Senators out of training camp. I think that he had a couple of fantastic preseason performances, and that was kind of the best hockey I saw from him all season long. So he's definitely still kind of in the same mix he was at in terms of my 2024 draft rankings, like middle of the first round, maybe a little bit lower than that. I see the upside, I see the flashes of skill, but there's still a lot of elements that give me some hesitation in terms of how it's going to translate to the NHL game. At number 12, we have Anton Salayev, the big, rangy left shot defenseman of the New Jersey Devils. I think he's a good play killer defensively. He's a really good mover. There's a lot of physical runway still for him to grow in terms of the physical, a proactive physicality at his huge frame. But overall, a play I think is still quite limited on puck, and maybe settles down as a number 4 or maybe number 3 defenseman longer term, but has a bit of a higher floor than other players on the lower end of this board. At number 13, we have Kayshawn Aitchison of the Barrie Colts, another 2025 NHL draft eligible, very violent, really good skater, wicked shot, scored like 26 goals from the blue line this season. Overall, he's a player that has some really intriguing qualities to be a specialist, a mobile, physical, shoot first in the offensive zone specialist from the blue line, but there are definitely limitations in terms of decision-making speed, scanning ability, the consistency behind the shoulder checks, especially on retrievals. He's a player that's quite raw in a lot of these facets, but definitely has some of these elements that NHL teams really want to add year after year at the draft. Last but not least, for the last 3 players, we have Dominic Badinka of the Carolina Hurricanes, a big, mobile right shot defenseman who projects very well on the defensive side of the puck. At number 15, Cameron Reed of the Kitchener Rangers, a 2025 draft eligible who skates really well, is very intelligent, and shows a lot of skill in his offensive activations, but can still get out-muscled on the defensive side of the puck. And finally, at 16th, we have Blake Fiddler, a very mobile, excellent rush defending right shot defenseman this season. He's the son of Vernon Fiddler at 6'4", young for the class, lots of runway in his development. But again, the decision making is a bit inconsistent with this player. So I hope that answers your question well, Soft Serve Scouting. These are the 16 players that I've liked the most in terms of the blue line talents these last 2 draft classes. In the next segment, we'll keep talking about some of these names, such as Carter Yakemchuk, Blake Fiddler, and Kayshawn Aitchison, as we delve into some Ottawa Senators themed question. But first, a quick message from our sponsors here at Locked On NHL Prospects. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts, with each 1 ounce serving having 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help keeping you feel fueled for longer. Personally, I love the no-shell variety. It's the perfect grab-and-go snack for my busy days. Whether I'm snacking at my desk, on a road trip, or just need a quick protein boost, they're always my go-to. And if you love cracking open every shell for that satisfying crunch, the in-shell variety are a classic favorite. Get snacking and get cracking with a snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. All right, let's keep this episode rolling with your questions here in the second segment. And we have a couple more questions here, as we'll be talking about 3 questions each in the last 2 segments, rather than just a full one question segment as we did there in the first one. Kicking things off with a question from Created Random on Twitter. With Carter Yakemchuk as a cornerstone in their prospect pool, could the Senators target a mobile two-way defenseman like Blake Fiddler or Kayshawn Aitchison at number 21 in the 2025 NHL draft to complement their existing blue line talent? Or is their focus better spent on offensive forwards to support their playoff push? Very good question. I think this is always kind of the internal tug of war if you're picking, especially in that 20 range at the draft, is do you want to solidify or do you want to go for upside? Do you want to go for that like falling talented forward, or do you want to shore things up a little bit more on the blue line? And I think with Kayshawn Aitchison, it's already quite clear that he will not be available at 21st overall. The physicality he brings is just so overwhelming. Teams are going to love him. I don't think he's still going to be on the board at that point in the draft. Blake Fiddler, on the other hand, I think is a much more legitimate target. And in terms of blue liners that are going to likely be available at that range, he's among the very top names I think that should be on the list for the Ottawa Senators. Yes, he's another right shot, but right-hand defensemen are always so valuable. His tools are also just really impressive in terms of the combination of skating and physicality, especially while defending the rush. Really suffocating rush defender who is excellent in the breakout, but can't really generate a zone entry into the offensive zone to save his life. There's some limitations on puck, but he's showing how he's able to influence play in terms of getting the puck out of the defensive zone, and especially big, raw, mobile defensemen who are young for draft classes and combine play killing off the rush and sparking breakouts with control and efficiency and dynamism. I always really like these profiles of players. I think they translate quite well and gives them a good fallback game as well if they only hit like a third pairing kind of role. But I really do see that second pairing upside with Fiddler. I think he's a more than legitimate target here for the Ottawa Senators. That said, I do think that going for a falling forward might be a higher value kind of option here. And this builds off of another question we have for the Senators here from Locked On Senators of the same podcast network here. So thank you for this question. Is what's the latest you could see Lynden Lakovic being picked? Asking for friends with the 21st overall pick. I think that if he's available at 21st overall, he'd be a great target for the Senators, as long as the expectation is not for him to be your big power forward that plays a physical game night in, night out. This is a soft skill player who's still learning how to add physicality into his game despite being 6'4". He's a really deft puck handler, a creative playmaker. The expectations should be based off of those tools rather than the necessity of being a power forward. But if you want to get that kind of profile of skill, if he's available in this range, I think he'd be a great fit for what the Sens are trying to build and what they still need to complement their forward core. That said, I don't think he's really going to fall past like the Montreal back-to-back picks at 16th and 17th overall. I think he'd be right up their alley in terms of a project to mold and build and channel towards a specific kind of big skill kind of role in the NHL. But that said, there are also a lot of other options. I think especially if you're looking to add a combination of skill and violence, might be a slight reach, but a player I would absolutely love in this slot for the Sens, especially since they don't have a second round pick, is Václav Nestoshil of the Muskegon Lumberjacks. 6'6" power forward. He's only started to really learn the physical side of the game this season, but he's really embraced it. He's been like average size his entire hockey career, but has had like this big late growth spurt and has really transformed his game around that. But the handling, the playmaking, even the goal scoring have this real level of dynamism and skill that you'd expect from a player who didn't have size on his side growing up. And he's a really interesting project, I think, that the Sens would absolutely love to have in their system. But another follow-up question to this coming from Nick Spence is, if not Lakovic, what about Malcolm Spence? Is 21 realistic for this player? I think it is realistic. This is kind of the range I see Malcolm Spence falling in on draft day. He doesn't have that standout dynamic skill, I think, to really be a top 15, top 18 level talent in this year's draft class, but he brings so much energy, good forechecking skill, good like off-puck movement in the offensive zone to find himself in goal-scoring positions. And he's just so opportunistic, and he works well at I think in a high-pace environment. He's just really, really reliable. You know what you're going to get, but it's probably going to be a third line, maybe middle six kind of player who's able to chip in a variety of ways, but he's not going to be a needle mover. So is that what the Sens need? I think that they should probably be swinging on a bit more upside on draft day, but he'd fit in very nicely in terms of the identity they've been trying to build there in Ottawa. But that wraps up the second segment. In the next one, we'll wrap things up with 3 questions on Jake O'Brien, Axel Sandin Pellikka, and Kieren Dervin. But first, a quick message from our sponsors here at Locked On NHL Prospects. All right, let's wrap up the show here in the final segment with your questions here in part 1 of our 2 mailbag episodes here this month. And kicking things off with a question from David Corbet. Do you think that Jake O'Brien could become the second best forward in this draft at some point in time? Maybe. I don't think it's likely. I'll put it that way. I think that there's perhaps like the range of upside for O'Brien extends just about enough to that level if everything breaks in his direction and other players don't hit their upsides. But if I'm placing my bets, I do not think that he's going to be quite that high level of an NHL player. I think he's going to be very good, but maybe like an Evgeny Kuznetsov level of talent if he really hits his high-end upside in terms of being a really dynamic playmaker, but lacking a bit in the pace department. And overall, I think with players like Michael Misa and James Higgins, Roger McQueen and Porter Martone, you have so much high upside kind of talent here at forward who have more size, more physical tools, more like pacey habits in their games that I think are going to translate a bit quicker to the NHL game than Jake O'Brien. That said, the handling ability, the playmaking, these elements are so dynamic with O'Brien that I can understand projecting him as a really high-end offensive producer at the NHL level. But moving on to the next question from Two Galag podcast, Mike asks, what can we expect fantasy-wise out of Axel Sandin Pellikka next year? This is a very interesting question. I'm a big fan of Axel Sandin Pellikka. He's a very fun right shot defenseman. And just to remind you, he's 5'11", 185 pounds as a right shot defenseman, 20 years old, and got drafted 17th overall in 2023 by the Detroit Red Wings and just put up a monster season in the SHL, scoring 12 goals, 17 assists, and 29 points in 46 games. In terms of like production at the SHL level among U20 talent, this is like top 6 all time, pretty much in the same category as guys like Moritz Seider and Nils Lundqvist in terms of young players who have been able to make really big offensive impacts at this level. And one thing I think that Sandin Pellikka has on his side compared to a player like Nils Lundqvist is a level of pace and intensity, off-puck physicality. He's a guy who's been initiating contact a lot more on the defensive side of the puck in recent seasons since getting drafted. And I think he's rounded out his game in a really nice way. He captained Team Sweden at the World Junior Championships this season, and he scored 4 goals and 10 points in those 7 games. He's just a highly involved player. But in terms of fantasy impact next season, I think that the fantasy value with this player is a bit more in the medium term rather than the exact short term. He's not going to have a Lane Hudson type impact. I think a guy like Zayne Parekh is going to have a much bigger offensive impact next season than Axel Sandin Pellikka will with the Detroit Red Wings, if he even is a full-time NHLer next season. I think it's possible he plays in the AHL for an extended stretch as well. But that said, because he brings a level of dual threat offense in the offensive zone with his shooting and playmaking ability complement each other very well, and his lateral mobility and skating strength, really being able to shift angles and drag defenders, drag checkers left and right. He's a guy that can manipulate a bit from that blue line, and I think if he does play in the NHL, should get some second power play minutes at least, where he should get some kind of offensive involvement too. But in terms of next season, I think that the overall upside on the fantasy side is medium to low, but in 2 or 3 years time, it gets a lot higher. So if you're in a keeper league, definitely go out and target this player. He's fantastic. But for just next season, if you're drafting, maybe for a late round swing, but overall not a guy that's going to necessarily be a needle mover next season if I were to take my bets. But to wrap up the show here, we have one last question from Windmill Dynasty Hockey over on Twitter. Any thoughts on Kieren Dervin? He's way under the radar for most, but he was impossible not to notice on Kingston's fourth line late in the year. I agree. He was definitely a standout in my Kingston Frontenac viewings down the stretch as well. He's a 6'2", 181-pound left shot center, first-time draft eligible this season, and he was ranked 71st among North American skaters by Central Scouting. He played most of this season at the Canadian high school level with St. Andrews College, and only played the last 10 games of the regular season with the Kingston Frontenacs before also playing in 11 playoff games. So he got into 21 games down the stretch. He collected 6 points in those games. Again, fourth line minutes. But what he brought was a lot of energy on the forecheck, some pretty mature off puck habits, and overall just being a very not high school style of player at the OHL level. He made that step look very, very easy. That's very impressive to me. But what made him impressive to me mostly at the AHL level was in terms of checking details and energy and overall positionality and the awareness on the ice, rather than any of his tools really being able to take over shifts. Yes, the energy is great, but I think he's more of a reliable checking fourth line projection at the NHL level than a top 9 one. But that said, he's a very fun player and a fun little under the radar guy that I think deserves to get a draft selection this year and in June. And if he doesn't, is going to be a big guy to look out for next season, especially if he delays his commitment to Penn State University for another year to take a full year in the OHL to maybe grasp a bit of a bigger offensive role there next campaign. But that wraps up this episode. Thank you so much for submitting your questions here today and for listening. If you're still hanging on here at the end of the show, I always appreciate it. If you're watching on YouTube, please do leave me a comment. What are your thoughts? If you have any other questions, please do leave those down below as well. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, please do make sure to make us your first listen of the day. For your second listen of the day, you're going to head on over to Locked On Fantasy Hockey, where Flip and Steel break down everything that you need to know to build yourself a sustainable and competitive fantasy roster. That's everything for me today. I'm your host, Sebastian High. Thank you so much for listening as always, and I can't wait to catch you tuning in again very, very soon.